In the beginning was the Word. No, at the end was the Word. After a long and patient metamorphosis, that within the poet transforms the object to word. So is the task of the Jewish poet in the post-war milieu of the 1940s, described by Avant-Garde. The poet needs to participate in a Messianic project, the creation with the word, which will eventually establish an integral correspondence between the object and the divine word. This paper looks into the implications of Messianic time in the poetry of two post-Second World War Jewish writers, namely Gall and Isidore Isou. I will proceed from their respective adaptations of Kabbalah and conceptions of Messianic time to considerations regarding the present moment, and finally take a look at how all this is tied together with poetry. Unfortunately, there is no time to compare the poet's ideas of Messianic time with the more philosophical ones, such as those of Walter Benjamin or Giorgio Agamben. Suffice to say that the seminal difference seems to be the retrospective nature of Agamben's and Benjamin's versions and the future-orientedness of Gall and Isou in evaluating the present. In other words, for Benjamin and Agamben, the present is primary. It always represents the pinnacle of development, whereas for Gall and Isou it is secondary and always subservient to the future to come. During the 1910s, the French-German Gall was involved in Berlin Expressionism, Zurich Dada, and Surrealism in Paris during the 20s. During the 30s, he turned to Jewish motifs as a reaction to increasing anti-Semitism and studied Kabbalah during the Second World War. Simultaneously, the Romanian Isou, the founder of Lettrism, was also inspired by the Jewish tradition and Kabbalah in particular. Isou was more than 30 years younger than Gall, which is noteworthy regarding their coinciding Kabbalistic inspiration. The Shoah fueled their Messianic aspirations, leading them to utilize corresponding sources. It is also noteworthy that the significance of the Kabbalah for contemporary Judaism was emphasized already during the Great War. For Gall and Isou, Kabbalah promoted anti-rationalism over the prevailing rational and optimistic attitudes in philosophy. The connecting factor between these two poets is the adaptation of a particular form of medieval Kabbalah into modern avant-garde poetry. Both writers applaud Abraham Abulafia, a Kabbalist and a philosopher, who they regard as a predecessor of modern experimental poetry. As Gall states, "I consider this 13th century man to be the direct precursor of those discovering the alchemy of word, such as Rimbaud, words in freedom as Apollinaire, and the word in itself as Mallarmé." In his posthumous Le Cercle Magique, Gall claims that one of his ancestors was indeed Abulafia, whom he calls the martyr of the word. Gall further connects his poetry with the Kabbalistic textual methods introduced by Abulafia. Curiously enough, Isou had reached a similar conclusion some years earlier. I quote, "Perhaps I would have been Abraham, son of Abulafia of Saragosse, he who had left in search of the mystical river, Sabbation, and wanted to obtain the knowledge of the covered essence of God by the permutation of the letters of the alphabet and the Talmudic numbers. Is this not my lettrism?" End quote. In addition to praising Abulafia as a paragon, he acknowledges the congruence of Abulafia's methods in his avant-garde poetry. Gall's understanding of the Kabbalah is true to Abulafia's theories because he states that it is only through the word and knowledge that the Kabbalists hope to reach the supreme goal, to discover God through God's name. However, he links poetry with the Kabbalah as he states that the Kabbalists do not search God, they search the name of God. This seems to be sufficient for them, and to me it strangely resembles the work of a poet. The poet searches for the name of God, the most perfect of all words. The focus on language and the name of God in Abulafia's theories is emphasized, and hence, the hermeneutic excess of interpretation becomes more important than meaning. What this means is that the Kabbalistic letter permutations were not required to be meaningful in the present. So Gall announces the homological relation between the Abulafian Kabbalah and his poetry. And the relation is similar also in Isou's case. For him, the reconciliation of the unity between man and God was the fundamental aim of poetry. This aim was inspired by the Messianic doctrine of Abulafia. Abulafia considered himself as the Messiah who would attain a unity with God following the successful use of letter permutations to reveal God's name. The Messianic vector, which is directed towards the future, requires a metamorphosis of both language and time. The ideal of the Gaulian alchemy of the word and Isuian experiments with letters was the so-called Pansemiosis, to which I return later on in this paper. In Gauls and Isu's poetry, the experimentation with language and representation is messianically motivated. Isu stated with rhetoric typical of Messianism to have uncovered, I quote, the method of creation that is the secret of the gods, which the Messiah must provide, and I consider my innovative contributions, both artistic and philosophical, as stages of the Messianic endeavor. End quote. Gaul did not have an outright Messianic program as Isu did, but he tended towards Jewish Messianism nonetheless. Especially in his late poetry, Gaul sought to gain knowledge about the gods via God's name, which would eventually establish a unity between man and God. This was the aim of the Messianic projects. It gives rise to a Messianic time, which opens a vector towards the future, affecting the present moment. The forms of Messianic future in Jewish Messianism are various, ranging from a kind of singular time to a utopian world. This somewhat general formulation applies to Gaul and Isu as well, because both postulated a Messianic future. Isu's quasi-religious model adopts a relatively traditional model of Jewish Messianism in the form represented by Abulafia and Kabbalah. Essentially, the mystic, or in Isu's case, he himself, could bring about the Messianic era. Isu found the means for this in Kabbalistic letter permutations, which have temporal implications already in Abulafia's theories, as they could bring the present and the future together in the guise of the Messianic project. But what enables such a radical abridgment of time? I think that Gaul may provide an answer in his poem Mark Chagall. I quote, "In the round flame of the Torah, the past and the present, the past and the future, dancing to the same macabre rhythms." End quote. The poem recalls a Jewish myth according to which the Torah was written with black fire on white fire. The black fire signifies the present world, and the white fire, Olam Chaba, which denotes an atemporal eternity that comes after the end of the world, the so-called world to come. In this sense, the past and the predestined future are entangled in the Torah. Even the present is included because the present participle dancing suggests ongoing action. The action does not, however, take place in this world, but in a transcendent realm. Gaul does not reveal anything further about the present at this stage. The divide between this and the transcendent world seems to be temporal. Evidently, the relation between historical and Messianic time is discontinuous, since no project can continue from one to the other. This limitation concerns the poetry of Gaul and Isu. The Messianic project reaches its conclusion by the arrival of the Messianic time. In this vein, Isu underlined the Messianic vector of his poetry by stating that it sends a total message towards the future. This formulates and indicates the existence of two distinct times, namely Olam Haseh, which designates the duration of the world from creation to its end, this is the time that we live in right now, and Olam Haba, the Messianic world to come. In addition, the distinction between space and time in the future-oriented Messianism should not be overlooked. As Gershom Scholem emphasizes, the importance of differentiating between Olam Haba and Atik Labo, which denotes the future and becoming. The latter connotes Messianic time as a future era, whereas the first is a realm of a manifest God. Based on these conceptions, Scholem discerns two kinds of Messianism, apocalyptic and mystic. Apocalyptic Messianism amalgamates Messianic time and the world to come by positing the Messiah at the end of days. In this case, the result is, of course, an infinite future. In the second mode, there is no such apocalyptic event, but a process of cleansing the soul and an inner wandering. In this variant, Messianic time and the world to come remain separate. However, Schollem's typology of Messianism is constricted, and often the two aspects of Messianic future were combined without any apocalyptic event. However, there is no such event in the theories of Gall or Isu. They seem to focus on the perfection of the world we currently inhabit. In other words, the Messianic thinkers were agents in the same history they imagined transcending, which illustrates the duality of times. For thinkers like Isu, the Messianic project was an exercise in personal perfection. And such project of perfection necessarily evaluates the present from the aspect of potentiality and arranges its potential accordingly in regards to future aim, the Messianic event. Even though the future is consistently beyond the present, Messianism makes it manifest in the present as lack, which may be lack of unity with God, with the lack of Messianic age, basically anything that is postulated and predestined. This structure is embedded in temporal concepts that describe the present, such as not yet and to come, which Gall and Isu both used. These concepts are rooted and applied in the now and reveal the fundamental incompleteness of the current state of affairs. Overall, Messianic time is always connected with the present moment, regardless of the temporal direction of its projections. Yet the experience of the present is ultimately fleeting. This is exemplified, well, obviously most of you already know him, by Beckett's Unnameable, where the inability of the main character to seize the presence of the present is expressed through a repetition of the instant that has frustratingly always passed from presence to history. Now, 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 now. As such, the fleeting present is accessible only through memory and representation as it instantaneously becomes part of the past. However, for Isu, the meaning of the present derives from the future. He illustrates this by writing that Isidore claims to stammer a future language. It is therefore never present, but to come. In itself, the present appears as empty and meaningless. It becomes meaningful only through the action that is aimed at the future, in other words, the Messianic project. In this light, Isu's idea of the present resembles that of Gall. The Messianic future is latent in Gall's poems, which reveal, according to him, a God who does not exist yet, but who will result from the Kabbalistic methods applied by the poet. The present is thus motivated by the Messianic future and is regarded through the temporal lack. In addition to the temporal aspect, Gall and Isu share the conception of God as the yet unknown, which is essential in the poet's Messianic project. As Isu states, the Jewish God is the center of a knowing around which we build the world. The center is the ground that appears to remain beyond cognition and meaning. In a like manner, Gall writes that one follows the course of zero around the nothingness, and the allusion to the very material sign of zero reveals that the shape of the course is round, which encircles the center of nothingness. The Messianic quest of the poet is more comprehensible in another verse of Gall's poem. I quote, "Voyager of nothingness, I am the gate to the abyss, the bridge across the night which you search all over." End quote. The voyager is an individual who journeys from somewhere to someplace else, but in nothingness there are no places. Yet, here the voyage refers to the circle of zero surrounding nothingness, the unknown center. Gall speaks of himself as the gate to the abyss and the bridge across the night, which recalls a Messianic quest, because both metaphors suggest that he has the access to the unknown. Now, how does this aspect of unknowability relate to language? For Gall and Isu, the present is characterized by the search for the names of the unknowable God by means of poetry. Edmond Chavez encapsulates the problematics of language and meaning once it is integrated with Messianism. I quote, "The passive representation, figure, future, the absence of figure, void." End quote. Chavez notes that the past, the whole of history in fact, is only accessible through representation, and it can no longer be present. but future lacks representation altogether because it is never present. In the sense put forward by him, future never exists in itself, nor can it be represented by language. In order to preserve this fleeting character, the future can only be ostensibly implied by a void. Such a void is contained in the elliptical orbit of zero around the nothingness. The void is the very lack in the present. It shows that language indeed lacks the means necessary to prematurely attain any aspect of the future that remains as unknown as God. Jabez sheds light on the situation of both Gol and Isu and their conceptions of present in view of the Messianic project. Due to the project, the present is suspended. Its potential is not realized because the Messianic project does not come to an end, and thus it does not fail or succeed. Rather, it maintains the temporal suspension between the present and the future. It hinges the end because the potentiality cannot be eliminated. Here we return to Gol's idea of the teleology of poetry, that is, his conception of the word being at the end. Language is the poet's means of leaning towards the future, but it cannot be the language we use every day. Due to the discontinuous relation of the present and the Messianic future, language must equally change. Hence, Gol and Isu both adopt the idea of Pansemiosis from the Abulafia and Kabbalah. Pansemiosis denotes the equivalency between letters and physical reality, which indicates that in the Kabbalah, language has acquired a special status. In short, Pansemiosis means that language is no longer merely epistemological and communicative, but rather becomes ontological and future-oriented instead. Pansemiosis is derived from the Jewish conception of creation by divine utterance. It means that, paradoxically, pansemiotic language is both an instrument of creation as well as a component of the creative world. This language does not, however, forfeit its creative abilities, and hence both Gol and Isu return to the idea of the creative divine world. As Gol notes, in order to express the essence of life, I quote, poetry must emanate the thing in itself, the Ding an sich. End quote. This is to say that poetry is directly and organically linked with things and would ideally exclude the aspect of human subjectivity altogether. By this move, conventional representation that always emphasized the absence of the thing it designates is supposedly erased. As Gol states, the word is substance. It is no longer there, as a means to an end, to mimic events and circumstances of nature. The poet's word is. Gol wants to erase the mimetic capabilities of language, at least from poetry. In a like manner, Isu explains that in Pansemiosis, I quote, the thing would turn into a letter, that is to say, into an abstract element with a phantasmal value considered on an unfamiliar level of its concrete reality. End quote. Isu is not only keen on abolishing mimesis, but suggests another, a transcendent real. The phantasmal and the unfamiliar both refer to what is unknown to the subject and suggest the transcendent world, the divine real. The departure from the level of reality signifies a departure from the world we inhabit, which aims at a messianic one. For both Gol and Isu, poetic and pansemitic language is essential in this messianic project. Accounting for this sense of language, Gol emphasizes the importance of the belief in the magic power of the letters and words, the conviction that with the help of language, one can venture into the realms of the ineffable, inexplicable, incomprehensible. In light of the Kabbalistic import of his poetics, Gol is not referring merely to poetic metaphors, but to a more thoroughgoing venture into the divine realm, which is clarified by Isu. As Isu claims, that what for preceding authors represented the dimension of silence and the unknown will become, thanks to me, the dimension of the known and of the new kind of speech. This term manifests the temporal duality. As Gol crystallizes, he who names God knows God. Now, to conclude, the Messianic project contains two aims that are almost amalgamated. On the one hand, it seeks to reinstate the unity with God via the divine word and the name of God, which in this context designates a literary textual means of poetry. On the other hand, The project aims at a Messianic age, which always suspends meaning and future as something not yet and to come. In fact, the Messianic project confirms the dualism of time, the present and the future. Isu's poetry is subject to this dualism as the poems will become, according to him, intelligible in the future. Gall, however, writes about the methods he will apply and their mystical history without actually applying them, which means that his poetry is essentially about the search for a poetic method. Even in Gall's metapoetical reflections, the Messianic time stands for a future that is suspended until the project comes to an end. And at this end, there is the word. Thank you.